Good morning. Hi, friends. Happy Monday. I'm Libby, and this is my audio journal, Finding Joy in the Shadows. Each week, I show up here, talk through the curveballs life throws our way, and help us to look for joy that still manages to find its way to sneak in, even when we are in our messiest moments. This space is part reflection, part resistance, and part love letter to anyone who's struggling and still showing up. I am working through my own stuff in real time. And if something I share helps you feel less alone or more grounded, then good. That means that we're doing this work together. Today, I want to talk about the kind of joy that comes after the unraveling, the kind you grow toward quietly, slowly, and truthfully. We're going to dive into what it really means to level up, not in the hustle culture way, but in the deeply personal, often painful, soul growing way. Because sometimes growth doesn't start with a big win, sometimes it starts with a breaking point. But before I get too far ahead of myself, per usual, let's take a few minutes to catch up on some recent happenings from around the world and dive into a few of the LPs or Libby's problems that I've been waiting to talk about. Some stories that I mentioned last week, but for time didn't have enough time to dive further into them. So last week I said I would spend more time sharing my thoughts on the whole Pope drama. So before we dive into today's topic, I want to get a few thoughts out that I've been holding on to for weeks now. Legit, this is the first time I am sharing these thoughts with anyone. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I already hit the record button, so no going back now. First off, learning about Pope Francis passing away made me genuinely sad. I am not a Catholic, nowhere close. So I never really understood the whole hoopla over the role of a pope, but I do have eyes. And it was clear that this man, regardless of job title, was, at the end of the day, a really good guy, a mensch. He supported humans in all shapes, sizes, colors, and genders. He loved animals, was the first, I believe, to admit that animals have souls. He supported love is love. And if you're someone like me who supports humanity over all else, then it's easy to see why Pope Francis, aside from all his titles and duties, was a good guy. And his presence on the stage, the world stage, will be missed. Okay, I wanted to lead with that because those are my genuine thoughts about the man. But now I want to walk you into a part of my brain, probably right over here, where all of my crazy conspiracy theories live. You ready for this? All right. For anyone who's been with me on this podcast journey, you might remember when I shared my skepticism a few months back on how Pope Francis was planning to celebrate Christmas last year, which sadly turned out to be his last Christmas. 2025 is a Jubilee year in the Catholic Church. Happens every 25 years like clockwork. Jubilee in its most basic form simply means to celebrate. Now, if you're like me and associate the word Jubilee more with Queen Elizabeth than the Vatican, you are in good company. But in the Catholic context, Jubilee is a sacred reset, time for mercy, renewal, and walking through symbolic doors towards healing and hope. Think of it as a spiritual do-over. Now, the Pope also has the authority to call a Jubilee outside the 25-year cycle, kind of like an emergency spiritual reset. We actually just had one of those in-between Jubilees back in 2015, 2016. Okay, so back to Christmas Eve 2024. Traditionally, the Pope opens these 4 ancient holy doors in Rome. These are literal doors that are sealed shut most years and only open during Jubilee to represent divine access. But this time, Pope Francis did something deeply symbolic. He opened a 5th one at a prison. I'm going to say that again. The Pope opened a 5th holy door at a Roman jail to include the incarcerated in this sacred act of mercy, hope, and grace. A jail that houses the kinds of people the world so often throws away. Now, again, I'm not Catholic. I only found out about this ceremony because the spiritual peeps I follow online were collectively losing their you-know-what over this. They were saying things like, this is acting like a massive energy portal. He's either letting something in or he is letting something out. The timing, the symbolism, it spooked them. It moved them. And honestly, that's what made me pause. Because until then, I had no idea any of these things ever happened. Like, ever. I don't think I've ever paid any attention to a Catholic Jubilee before. So the ceremony comes and goes, okay? No light beams, no major earthquakes, no angels showing up in my backyard. But I did say we'd have to stick a pin in it and see how it all plays out. Well, Pope Francis passes away mere few months after performing this ceremony. And then just days later, history is made. For the first time ever, we have a new pope, and he's American from the south side of Chicago, no less. And I love Chicago. I was just there in March to see J. Hope. I'm heading back there in a few days from the time I'm recording this for work. I love this city. As my nephew says, it's like a really big Minneapolis. He's 20 years old. He doesn't talk like that. But that's still how I hear his voice in my head when I hear him speaking. Chicago's brought us so many things. Deep dish pizza, Ferris Bueller, the Cubs, and oh yeah, that guy with the funny name. Remember him? Barack Obama. Chicago's where he launched his political career on the message of the audacity of hope. And that's what came to me because I realized this word hope keeps showing up. Hope, jubilee, mercy, renewal. If you're someone like me and you look for clues from the universe, the full picture isn't clear yet. The pieces are still forming, but the synchronicity of the word hope continuing to show up right now, that's impossible to ignore. So I'm continuing to watch and see what happens next. And so I'm going to continue to stick a pin in that. Okay, what else? Oh, yes. Before we dive into today's main topic, I forgot I was going to get into the whole end of times Pope prophecy I mentioned last week. So apparently there was this cryptic medieval list that was supposedly written by Saint Malachi. And it claims to have accurately predicted every single pope in order right down to the final one, Peter the Roman. That's the name a lot of peeps were anticipating would follow the 111th pope, who technically was Pope Benedict. But then we got Pope Francis instead. So when it came time to choose the next one, peeps were watching with bated breath to see if the new pope would have any version of Peter in their name, either by birth or by their pope name and title. Because if that happened, according to this prophecy, it would have signaled the end of days, or at the very least, end of the Catholic Church as we know it. Well, that didn't happen. Okay, newsflash, that didn't happen. Now, here's my 2 cents for what it's worth. If I knew about this list, little old me, you best believe at least one, if not all of those cardinals knew about it too. And would they really go out of their way to nominate someone even remotely Peter adjacent if it meant potentially fulfilling a centuries-old apocalyptic prophecy? Yeah, I'm thinking probably not. So while it was fun to watch all of these conspiracy ideas play out on the socials, it also kind of felt more like a foregone conclusion, a little self-fulfilling prophecy instead. Okay. Those were the topics I wanted to spend a little time just getting those thoughts out. They've been sitting in my brain for so long. So thank you for hopping into my conspiracy-filled part of my brain and letting me share those stories with you. If all of that stuff, all of those ideas were new for you and now they're going to be ruminating in your brain, well, welcome to my world. You're welcome. All right. So that is everything I had for a Libby's problem. So we'll go ahead and dive into today's topic. As usual, I have my cold brew on hand. And Lulu Joy is at daycare today. I'm going to probably go grab her after I'm done recording this because Homegirl did not want to go to daycare this morning. So she's 7 years old, just a big kid, and she likes to usually walk herself in. She knows when she goes through the door, she takes a left, she knows where her room is. But for whatever reason, when I brought her in, I put her down on the ground to let her walk herself in. She just melted to the ground. And when one of the counselors went to go pick her up, she ran back to me. So broke my heart, but I knew that if I brought her home and I recorded today with her, she would be barking in the background. So I'll go get her after this, but for today, there shouldn't be too much background noise, especially none from Miss Lulu Joy. Okay. For today's topic, for the rest of today, I want to begin a discussion about leveling up. I know this is a podcast, so I won't be able to hear your comments or answers, and I get that. But still, I want you all to know that while I may be the one holding the mic today, I am not speaking from a stage or a pedestal. I am speaking among you, standing in the crowd right next to you. And if you haven't really spent time thinking about what it means to level up before, that's totally fair. This is still a new concept for me too, and I'm still learning. I'm curious though. Has anyone ever heard this term before? Leveling up? The first time I heard it was last year in February 2024, smack dab in the middle of my healing journey. I was talking to someone about what I had just gone through and how I was working to heal. I was explaining all the steps I was taking, the journaling, the therapy, the prayer, the manifesting, the boundaries, the rituals, the tears. And somewhere in that conversation, I said, I just feel really fuzzy, uneasy. Like I know I'm doing everything right, but I still feel anxious. And they responded by saying, oh yeah, it's because you changed your frequency. You're leveling up. I'm sorry, what? My what? I'm leveling what? I remember making this confused face like, what did you just say? I had never heard those phrases, changing my frequency, leveling up in that context. And it kind of sounded like something out of a video game, leveling up. But the more they explained it, the more it started to click. They told me the reason I felt so uneasy and weird was because I had left the safety and security of my old life, my previous path. Now, I am the one who chose to walk away from it. It didn't make it any less painful, but it was still my comfort. And it was all I knew. But now I had stepped off of that path. And since my new path hadn't been written yet, because I was still in the process of declaring what I wanted and where I was going, that's why everything felt so uncertain. I had never heard it put that way before, but I was intrigued. So I cracked open the internet, started reading. If this is your first time hearing the phrase leveling up, here's a simple way to think about it. According to Merriam-Webster, to level up means achieving significant personal, professional, or spiritual growth. And my homegirl, Mrs. Google, tells us it's about recognizing the gap between where you are and where you need to go. And I really liked this one because that's exactly what it felt like for me. I was standing in a gap. I was no longer who I used to be, but I wasn't who I was becoming yet either. And I think that's where a lot of us land when we start doing the work. I chose to talk about this topic today because it feels like the natural next step after last week's episode. That episode was all about my life being turned upside down, about being cracked open. It was the unraveling, the reckoning, and the deep examination of my behavioral patterns. This one is about what comes next, what comes after. Once the hard work starts and the dust begins to settle, when we're left with a choice, do we fall back into our old habits the next time we're tested because it's our comfort? Or do we stand in the discomfort, trust the process, and keep stepping into our new? Just like Mrs. Google says, it's about recognizing the gap between where you are and where we need to go. But here's the thing. Leveling up doesn't always look like a picture-perfect glow up we might see on social media. It doesn't always come with clarity or confidence or an applause section cheering us on. Sometimes leveling up means sitting in the quiet, doing the hard, unglamorous work of becoming. And that's what I want to talk about today. So what does it really mean to level up? Simply put, it means to grow, personally, professionally, or spiritually. That's it. We're talking about growth. But it's not always the kind of growth that's visible. Sometimes it's the kind that quietly reshapes us from the inside out. And when we choose to do that work, not for the applause, but for the alignment, to learn and to do better, that shift can change everything. Not just for us, but for our families, our communities, and even the institutions we are a part of. Leveling up doesn't always announce itself either. Sometimes we don't even realize it's happening until it's already happened. We wake up one morning and realize everything has changed. We are no longer in the same place anymore. And no matter how much we wish for it, we can never go back to who we were before. That moment is both liberating and terrifying. I remember feeling so scared when I was in the middle of it, because now we find ourselves standing in the in-between, the gap, suspended between the version of ourselves we have now outgrown and the ones we are still learning how to become. And I remember how disorienting, painful, and raw everything felt in those early days, when the life I thought I was building had completely unraveled. I was suddenly faced with decisions I never imagined I would have to make. I'll never forget waking up in a panic, realizing that the version of me who existed just 24 hours earlier was now gone. So was the life I had worked so hard to build. And so were some of the people I used to reach for. The ones I thought would always be in my corner. They were now gone too. Poof. Just like that. Like I said before, sometimes you don't even know it's happening until it already has. Only in hindsight can we trace the moments that led to the crack. Feeling how the energy shifted, seeing the changed behavior, not understanding why, the silence, the lies, the betrayal. But in those early moments, all we know is something sacred has ended and something unknown is beginning, and it's scary. That's the part no one posts about. The unraveling, the blackout, the quiet in between when everything inside us just shuts down. It's not clarity. It's not a glow up. It's grief. It's raw. It's terrifying. Because when the life we thought we were building suddenly disappears, and all we're left with is a blank page and the sacred, sobering task of having to start over, it's scary. But that's where the real leveling up begins. I know that was a lot. I'm going to pause for a moment to let my words sink in. How's everyone doing? Still with me? Curious how many of you listening to my voice right now have found yourselves in a similar place. How many of you have reached a point where something outside your control forced you to have to make a hard choice, one that left you rebuilding your entire story? Sometimes the invitation to grow doesn't feel like an invitation at all. Trust me, I know. It can feel more like a door slamming shut. And even if we're the ones who had to slam it, it's still a goodbye we weren't ready for. And it's one we didn't ask for. It's now a life turned upside down in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Or maybe for some of us, the invitation has come through a divorce, a death, a diagnosis, maybe a layoff, or a natural disaster. It could be literal or metaphorical. And suddenly, we're left with a choice. We can either stay in the rubble and wallow, or we can begin the slow, sacred work of rising. The moment we choose to rise up, the moment we hit our breaking point and say, not today, that's where growth meets us. But here's the truth. This path isn't meant for everybody. And that is okay. I'm going to say that again. This path might not be for everybody, and that's okay. Think about it. How many of us have examples of this in our lives right now? People who we can tell they chose not to grow. Because maybe they didn't have the strength to face the consequences of their actions, or the skills to fully examine them. Or maybe they didn't have the capacity to hold themselves accountable for the part they played. Or maybe they still carry so much shame for how they acted. And that shame is so strong, the only thing they know how to do is to avoid it and blame everyone else. I'm here to tell you and them it's okay. Because one of the biggest lessons I am learning on this spiritual journey is that every single one of us has a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, some people's purpose is to show us what it looks like when we choose not to grow. So let me ask you this. Does it feel like you're being asked or maybe even challenged to grow right now? Have you found yourself on one of God's strongest soldiers lists this year yet again? Because sometimes that's what growth feels like. Like I said a few moments ago, it's not always a gentle invitation. Sometimes it feels more like a summons, like the universe threw our name into the ring before we were even ready. And now here we are, tired, confused, cracked open, trying to figure out what the heck comes next. Trust me, I've been there. I know exactly how that feels. So now I want to share what the beginning of leveling up looked like for me. Like you've heard me say before, it started with one small pivotal decision. When I shouted out loud that I didn't want to go any further into the darkness. That was the moment. Now, saying those words didn't bring automatic healing, but it did light the spark for what came next. It was my turning point, the moment I stopped spiraling, and started listening. Because here's the thing. It's easy to talk about growth once we're on the other side of it. But what about when we're still limping? What about when the glass is still embedded in our hands and knees from slowly crawling our way forward? Because that's where I was when I finally accepted the challenge to grow. Everything in my life had just fallen apart. I easily could have stayed there, crumbled on the ground, wallowing in self-pity, doubt, sadness, and anger. But I didn't. That quiet, defiant statement, no, I do not want to go any further into the dark, was the moment I chose to turn towards something new. That moment, the decision to not go any further into the dark didn't automatically fix anything. It didn't heal me, and it definitely didn't come with a "you are here" map showing me where to go next. But it did mark something important, the end of my willingness to stay stuck. Because when we find ourselves there in that quiet place of no more, when we don't know what comes next, but we know we can't stay where we are, that's the first step towards growth. That's the moment we begin to rise. We're still in the gap, still aching, still unsure, but we've accepted the invitation to move forward. And in that moment, something within us opens. A crack of light begins to shine. We notice a shift in our posture. However subtle, however slow, it's there. Now, I'm not going to lie to you. What comes next is probably the most challenging part. This is where things start to get real. Because the next step we take after accepting the invitation to move forward, to level up, is sitting down and having a conversation with ourselves. The one where we ask, what happened? And maybe even harder, what part did I play? This is why some people choose not to level up. Because even though they admit they are not happy, even though they want to change and they want to move forward, they are not ready to handle what comes next, the accountability stage. Now, I want to share with you what it looked like for me to sit in the accountability stage. Like I said on this podcast before, I am not a licensed therapist. I am not here to hand out clinical advice or act like I have it all figured out. And if you got last week's episode, you heard me say a few times, I am human. I am not perfect. So am I about to give you some picture perfect next step? Nope. But I'm going to lay out how I worked through it, how I started to take accountability in a way that was honest, messy, and completely my own. I grabbed my journal, sat down at my desk, right here, and started writing everything down. Everything, every detail, every thought, every feeling, all of the pain. And I didn't hold back. I called myself out too, quietly, on paper, line by line. Some of the questions I asked myself sounded like this: what the heck just happened? What role did I play? Why did this hit me so hard? What was I really mad about? What was I hoping they would give that I didn't get? Was I reacting from the moment, or was I reacting from something deeper? Where did I let my emotions lead instead of pausing to check in with myself? This was a big one. What would I gain by holding on to the anger? And if I could go back, would I have done anything differently? These are not questions we can answer in 5 minutes. For me, some of them had me staring at the wall for hours. Some of them made me cry. But I answered them, each one, honestly, fully, and without censoring myself, because I knew that in order to move forward, I first had to see, accept, and admit the parts I played. This step is not for the faint of heart, but it's necessary. I had to admit that I played a part in the chaos too, not because I was a bad person, but because I am human. But most importantly, I had to also see, accept, and admit that the people I was tangled up with, they were human too. Were there things I wish I could have changed? Absolutely. I I had an endless supply of shoulda, coulda, wouldas. I went down a massive rabbit hole when I started to untangle myself from the chaos I was in. And in doing so, like I mentioned in last week's episode, I didn't stop there. I started to recognize patterns, my own patterns, the ones that had been showing up in different ways throughout most of my adult life. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, reliving the lowest points of my life. My best friend since 8th grade, Jessie, was there with me. And she looked at me and said, "Sweetie, I know you're in the feels right now and kicking yourself over everything, but at the end of the day, if these are the worst things someone can say you did, they're really not that bad." And that's when the light bulb went off for me. At the end of the day, I am human. I am flawed. But guess what? So are all of you. Once I had that epiphany, I noticed my anger was beginning to recede. And for the first time in a long time, I was able to fully release it. I could finally take a full breath and exhale. It felt like a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders instantly. It was then that I was able to apologize, including to myself. Yes, there were things I said and did that I wish I hadn't. Things I would go back and change if I could. But the truth is, I said them. I let my emotions take over my reaction, a key pattern I uncovered throughout this process. And for that, I was truly sorry. But most importantly, I forgave them too, because they are human also. And that right there, that shift in perspective, is where the real leveling up happens. Because when we can honestly look at our own action, name where they came from, take accountability without spiraling into shame, and offer that same level of understanding to someone or something that hurt us, even while we're still healing, that's growth. That's grace. That's when something new becomes possible. It's not about letting anyone off the hook. It's about choosing wholeness over blame. That's where growth lives. And that's when we level up. So if you are in that space right now, first off, I am really sorry for the pain you're carrying and for what you're having to untangle yourself from. But if you find yourself sitting in the wreckage of something you didn't ask to lose, maybe the invitation isn't to just move on or to simply forgive and forget. Maybe today's episode can be your invitation to move through it, to look at your own part, not with blame, but with deep compassion. Because sometimes the most radical thing we can do is tell ourselves the truth and still love ourselves anyway. And remember that fuzzy feeling I described I was feeling? The uneasiness, the anxiety, that sense of standing on shaky ground, even though I knew I was doing all the right things? It didn't just disappear overnight, but eventually it quieted. Because once I took ownership of my part, once I stopped fighting what was and started facing what is, the fog began to lift. And in its place came something I hadn't felt in a long time: direction. After I accepted and took accountability for the role I played, after I released all of my anger, apologized, and forgave, that was the moment I stepped out of the gap. That was the moment I fully leveled up. Okay, I think I have babbled on long enough. As always, we will continue to add to this next week. Remember, what we water grows. So let it be joy, let it be truth. Peace out, friends.